Okay, I'll go ahead and get started with a welcome to all of you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this webinar to learn about the issue of pay equity, the gender wage gap, and the impact that these issues have on our Reformed Jewish community. I'm Rabbi Marla Feldman. I'm the Director of Women of Reformed Judaism, WRJ. This webinar is part of our WRJ Women Act series, which is designed to raise awareness about high priority social justice issues. It's timely that we're holding this webinar today on Equal Pay Day. Studies have documented that women working full-time in the United States continue to earn less, 80% on average, than men in comparable jobs. For women of color, the gap is even greater. Equal Pay Day marks the number of additional days the average woman has to work into 2018 in order to earn the same salary as a man earned at the end of 2017. Sadly, the gender pay gap exists also within Jewish institutions at similar rates, and salary data from the Reform Movement professional associations reveals that Reform institutions are not immune from these societal problems. The issue of pay equity has often been defined as a woman's issue, but we know that this is an issue of human rights and an issue of social justice. Through the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, which has been spearheaded by the Women's Rabbinic Network and Women of Reformed Judaism, and made possible with a generous grant from the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, the entire Reform movement has been focusing on this issue and committing to tackling the gender wage gap within our own institutions. Economic justice and equality for women are among our core principles, and we have to get our hands around this issue and this continuing challenge if we are going to be true to our own values. During this session, we will learn about some of the factors that lead to the continuing wage gap. We will be exploring possible interventions to address the problem, and we'll introduce you to the resources available through the Reform Pay Equity Initiative. Our first speaker will be Rabbi Mary Zamor, who will provide the Jewish context for this issue. Rabbi Zamor is the Executive Director of the Women's Rabbinic Network, the International Organization of Reform Women Rabbis. She is the editor of and contributing author to The Sacred Table, Creating a Jewish Food Ethic, published by the CCAR, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist. She's currently working on her second anthology with the CCAR on the topic of Jewish ethics and money. Since her ordination by Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in New York in 1997, Rabbi Zamor served congregations in central New Jersey for over 18 years, including Temple Emmanuel of Westfield and Temple B'nai Or in Morristown, New Jersey. Rabbi Zamor is co-leading the Reform Pay Equity Initiative along with me, and we are jointly committed to narrowing the wage gap for all female employees of the Reform movement. Following Rabbi Zamor will be attorney Jean-Marc Favreau, who will speak specifically about the gender wage gap, including some of the causes and effective interventions that might narrow that gap. Mr. Favreau is a partner at Peer, Gann and Geisler LLP in Washington, D.C. He is a labor and employment attorney who has negotiated countless employment contracts, retirement and severance agreements for rabbis, cantors, and other clergy and non-clergy professionals. He has written and presented to practicing clergy and seminary students on a range of issues related to clergy negotiations and gender pay inequity. He grew up in New York City, where he went to a yeshiva day school until 4th grade, when his family withdrew him because the school was segregating boys and girls in the classroom. So he comes by his gender activism honestly. So right now I'll turn it over to Rabbi Zamor, who, when she is finished, will turn it over to Mr. Favreau, and then he'll turn it back to me to provide some specifics on the Reform Pay Equity Initiative. Rabbi Zamor?
Thank you, Rabbi Feldman. So we're going to start a little bit with some text. And this is a well-known story, the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. They come forward to the community, to Moses, Aaron, and the other elders, asking that, for their right to inherit their father's property, his estate. The father has just died. There are no male heirs. And at this point in the law, women are not allowed to inherit. And so they bring their complaint before the elders of the community, and they pose it in a way that we, from the modern point of frame, may have a little impatience for. They say in verse 4, why should the name of our father be done away from among his family because he had no son? So they make the argument that it's their father's name that will be blotted out, will be forgotten if the inheritance rights are not transferred within the family. Now, this, of course, is a patriarchal argument. It's a tribal argument. And then they get to the point, give to us a possession among the brethren of our father. Meaning, don't let this go outside of the immediate family when we women are here to inherit. Now, this story is often held up as one of the best examples of women speaking out for their rights. And in fact, it's a very happy story because in the verses that follow that we don't see here in this text, they are given the right to inherit, and the law changes because they spoke out. But it's interesting. What we don't normally see in this text is something that's right under our noses. The women go to Moses. They come to the edge of the tent of meeting. They offer their question. Really, they're posing a legal question. Why can't we inherit? They add, of course, they say it in the language of their time, calling out that this is for the sake of their father's name. But then Moses, in turn, brings the question to God, and God gives the answer. Now, there are plenty of other times in Jewish text when men and women, but specifically women, call out to God for help in a hard situation, and God answers them directly. So this could have happened here. God could have overheard their going to their community and asking for a new form of law. But here we see the succession of the complainant going to the community leader, the rest of the community, and that in turn turning to God for adjudication. And I think this is important because we learn here that the role of community is important. In the end, God gives the answer, and it's a good answer, and it's one that we build on continually to this very day in the work we're doing today, asking for equality. But we see here, it's not just a woman's question. It becomes the question of the entire community. So now we're going to go to a little bit different text on the next slide, just keeping all of this in mind. This, again, is a very well-known text. Here we have a text that from the center of Leviticus, this is the center of what we call the Holiness Code, telling us to have fair, first to not falsify, but then in the second part of it, that we should have fair weights and measures, and going through all these different types. And what's nice here is in verse 36, you see the refrain in the Hebrew of tzedek, tzedek, tzedek. In the English, it said honest balance, honest weights, honest ephah, honest hin. And I love the fact that you have this refrain in the Hebrew. It's not only poetic, it propels you forward. But to me, in this case, it speaks to the fact that there are many different levels of tzedek. There are many different levels of justice. When one is facing injustice in her world, when one sees the bias with which she lives every single day, we call out tzedek. Hopefully that is heard by the leaders of our community, and they in turn say, tzedek, we need justice here. And in turn, they amplify that complaint, that call for justice to the entire community, who in turn hopefully replies with a very strong tzedek. And hopefully together we can all work together to get to that tikkun olam, to the ultimate, to tzedek. And I believe that we as a Jewish community are at that point. The Reform Jewish community is able to hear the cry of tzedek. We're able to see the biases that affect the workplace that we live in every single day. We're able to see the injustices that have been going on within our own community, unfortunately. But we also have the strong tools of our love of justice, our love of egalitarianism, our ability to organize and educate and to make change. And therefore, all together, we will create tzedek. Jean-Marc, we now turn to you.
All right. Thank you all for having me. I think it's first important to point out that, as we all know, it's 2018, and we're still talking about significant differences in the amount that congregations and Jewish organizations pay to their male and female clergy. And, you know, I deliberately don't use the term pay gap here because, I mean, I'll be using it in the course of my conversation here, but I think terminology is important. And to say there's a pay gap or gender pay inequity is sort of a passive phrase and seems to suggest that this problem is one akin to gravity, where it's some immutable force. But this is a societally created, maybe a man-made created problem that can be changed. And it's a decision that we've made as a society, however conscious or subconscious, to treat women as worth less than men for the same work. So I'm glad we're talking about this today. I'm glad that this is a conversation I'm seeing is happening more often, both in the reform movement and in society at large. I think WRN is doing some great work, and some other organizations. And thank you again for letting me participate despite the Y chromosome. But as someone who negotiates clergy contracts, I hope I can provide something valuable to this discussion. So there's no question, the data shows that male rabbis and clergy and other male Jewish workers are paid more than their female counterpart. If we're to look across the board, you know, unfortunately, the data that we have is best for rabbis. There's some data for cantors. But when I talk about the numbers here, I'm going to be primarily talking about the numbers from the CCAR survey that they put out every other year. But if you look across the board at rabbis, the male rabbis tend to make about 18 or 19% more than female rabbis. And that's sort of in line with what it is for society in general. But it's a little more helpful to look at the numbers with respect to certain variables, most importantly to congregation size, as the CCAR's most recent salary study does. Their most recent study was done in 2016 and 2017. And I'm going to quickly go over some of the takeaways that we have made from a comparison of this most recent data with the data that they had from the last time they collected salary data based on gender, which was back in 2012. And that was based on numbers from 2010 and 2011. We were hoping that this most recent survey would show that the pay gap has gone away or at least diminished. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. In some respects, the pay gap has actually widened. So you can look at the slide that's up now, and this shows sort of our analysis. And let me just point out a few things. There are 21 categories where we can make this comparison between of the gender pay gap between the 2010 data and the 2016 data. The gap is narrowed in 9 of those categories. You'll see those in green. It's widened in 11 of those categories. Those are the red ones, and it's stayed the same in one. Of the 20 categories where we can make an average salary comparison, male rabbinic average salaries have increased more than female rabbinic average salaries in 13 of those categories. We can't compare the average salaries for the categories for the 1801 and larger for the assistant rabbi category because the 2010 and 2011 data doesn't provide the average salaries there, but it does provide the pay gap number, as you can see on the chart. So what this shows us is that larger congregations have done a better job than smaller congregations at closing the pay gap for senior and for solo rabbis. The pay gap has widened significantly, though, for solo rabbis in smaller congregations, and those that are 400 and under. For the 6-year period between the data sets, the male rabbinic average salary grew significantly more than the female average rabbinic salary as follows. In the under 150 family congregations, the male average grew by 14.03%. Their salaries grew by 14%. The female average grew by only 1.77%. For the 151 to 250 category, the male average grew by 11.4%, and the female average grew by 4.46%. And for the 251 to 400 category, the male average grew by 15.13%, and the female average grew by 8.6%. In 2010 and 2011, female associate rabbis had actually achieved pay equity. Superiority actually might be a better word there because they were making more than their male counterparts. In every category except a couple, the 601 to 800 and the 1001 to 1200. But in 2016 and 2017, female associate rabbis had achieved pay equity in only one category, and that was the 801 to 1000 category. In every single associate rabbi category, the gender pay gap has widened. So the next question is why? Why do we see these differences and this inequity? Why has it widened? A lot of the reasons we can attribute to that are the same reasons we see generally in society. Some of them are particular to the clergy world, but let me just name a few. For one, there's a lot of wage and salary secrecy. People don't talk about it. Again, for rabbis, there's a little more transparency now because we have the CCAR and we have the data that they put out, at least for the reform movement. But there's not a lot of sharing between rabbis and others, between colleagues, between rabbis and their communities, between other clergy and other employees of Jewish congregations and organizations. And this discussion, as I'll discuss in a minute, is important. It's important for us to talk about our own experiences and talk about these issues, and to raise awareness, to talk about how we've sought to overcome these problems and so on. Another issue that contributes to pay inequity is that women tend to underestimate their own value, or they anticipate lower salaries. And there are studies out there that show that women tend to be more conflict averse and less likely to negotiate for more. There's a book by Linda Babcock and Sarah Leshever called Women Don't Ask, Negotiation and the Gender Divide, that I highly recommend to read because it's great insight into these issues. And our experience in working with male and female rabbis and educators and cantors and all of that is that women tend to walk into negotiations valuing their services less, and they also tend to jump out to end the negotiations a little bit earlier, faster than their male counterparts. Another issue is that women tend to be less mobile. This is especially a problem in smaller communities where there may only be one Reform congregation. It's less of a problem, obviously, in major metropolitan areas like New York, San Francisco, but it is a problem in those smaller communities, and it's especially a problem when you have a spouse or a partner who is a primary breadwinner, and it limits your ability to just pick up your family and leave. Just a couple more. There's still a motherhood penalty. Women still pay a higher price for having children and for taking on caregiving responsibilities and duties. And I think, obviously we've seen a lot of change with men stepping up a little more in the caregiving arena, but we still have the remnants of this problem. And then last but not least, as hard as it is for us to admit, there is still a lot of discrimination out there, and there's a lot of implicit bias that keeps employers, congregations, and Jewish organizations from treating women with the equal dignity and respect that they should be getting to men. So the last piece of what I want to talk about is what we can do about all of this, what you can do. First, as Mary said, and as Marla referenced, this is a community issue. This is not purely a women's issue. It's an injustice that has to be addressed by men and women alike. I don't know how many men we have on this call with us today, but I'm sure it's a minority, and I would hope that in the future we could get more men to call in and listen, or to come to the workshops at conferences and participate in activities that raise awareness about gender pay and equity. And speaking of calls like this, education by rabbis is key to addressing this issue. Rabbis, cantors, other Jewish employees, you need to start talking about these issues with your lay leaders and members of your congregation. You need to make them aware of gender inequality issues. You need to talk to your colleagues at other congregations, at other organizations, and within your own congregation and organization. You need to talk to other employees. Okay, so if you're the rabbi, you should be talking to your clergy, and you should be talking to your educator about these issues. And then we need to be talking to the Jewish community as a whole. You need to be a voice on gender issues in the community, speaking and writing publicly about these issues. Once we've done that education, we need to turn it into action. Some of that action is internal to your organization or to your congregation. Again, that's conversations with lay leaders, with your allies in the lay leadership, within the congregation or your organization, to set the stage, to ring the bell, and to make this, put this at the forefront. And this is a conversation that you need to be having year round. It's not as effective if you're going into negotiate a contract and you're saying, hey, there's inequity in male and female salaries, let's fix it right now. The stage has to be set early, and the conversation has to be continuing and ongoing. Those conversations also should be focused on the we, on the community, not on your personal interests. Even though a large part of the goal of talking about this may be to increase your salary, it should be talked about in terms of a way, how can we address this problem? How can we as a congregation, as an organization, as the reform movement, address and try and fix this problem? Now, the lay leadership and your allies can actually take the lead in these conversations. They can help pave the way. They can talk to other board members and others in the community. And when you're talking to people, don't discount your male allies. They're going to be as important as your female allies. Continue having conversations with other clergy member, with other colleagues, employees in your congregation. Share your experiences and best practices. So those are the internal things some of the internal things that can be done. There are things you can do outside of your organization. There are conversations with others. There are discussions like this webinar, conversations and workshops at conferences. There's social events, even if you're just at the bar with some colleagues talking about it. Again, share your best practices and your knowledge of the issue. Start talking about it. Get other people to start talking and thinking about these issues, and put this on the radar. And I'll throw in another thing that we should be doing. And again, I think the WRN is doing a good job of this, but just not just educating yourself, but staying on top of the issues. There was, in fact, yesterday or the day before, there was a recent court decision that came out of the Ninth Circuit about gender inequality. And the gist of it was that an employer can't use prior salary history as a reason for paying women less than men. And there's some good articles out there in the Washington Post and New York Times about this case. And just stay aware, educate yourself about these issues. So let me close by just reiterating that the reform movement has been a champion of a lot of different social issues, social justice issues, human rights, immigration, labor rights, criminal justice reform. Of all these issues, addressing the inequality between men and women in the clergy and in other Jewish positions in the reform movement, this is the one issue that we can address just completely within the movement. We don't need legislation, we don't need litigation or any sort of outside help to do this. We can and we should commit as a movement to ensure that our congregations and our other organizations treat male and female employees, clergy, equally. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Favreau. I want to let everyone know with great appreciation that you stepped in at the very last minute. Michael Gann, who is a partner in the same law firm, was scheduled to be on this call and was called away to court. Some of you have heard about because related to the Amazon case and the Postal Service, and so high priority issue also in the news very much. So thank you for stepping in at this very last minute and providing that wonderful overview. What I'd like to do now is provide an overview of the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, where we are and what we're hoping to achieve. As we've been seeing some of the data that Mr. Favreau mentioned from the CCAR, and also a growing set of data from other associations within the reform movement, the Cantors Association, the educators, the early childhood educators, and others are also doing surveys, and we're finding very consistent results. So as we become aware of this and recognize it really is a systemic problem within the reform movement, just as it is in society as large, we need a systemic approach to address this problem. And as was just said, this is a problem we can solve within our movement. We certainly are on record as caring about this as a social justice issue and inequity, we really just need to do it. So we, the Women of Reform Judaism and the Women's Rabbinic Network got together and put our heads together to think about how we really can make this a movement-wide conversation. And we were blessed with a very nice grant from the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York to create this Reform Pay Equity Initiative. The goal, quite simply, is to close the wage gap within the reform movement and to set the stage and provide a model that others can use within the Jewish community and beyond as well. So we've begun to bring the whole community together for a conversation around this issue through education, through training opportunities, and making a shared commitment. We really think that we can move the needle on this issue. So the way we have approached this is by first gatherings of leadership of all the affiliates of the reform movement coming together, making a commitment to address this issue, also making a commitment to share their data and their resources and their best practices. With the blessing of that grant, we were able to engage an economist who is preparing an analysis of all of the data that currently exists that will allow us to see a benchmark of what the unified data tells us throughout the reform movement. And that economist will be working with us going forward to help develop future surveys as well so that we can track our, hopefully, success on these issues. You can go to the next slide now as well. So that's the movement gatherings, bringing everyone together, the combined data analysis, making internal commitments, and those internal commitments have been important. All of the major affiliates have agreed to put this on their agenda for conversation. And so we've been able to do learning sessions at the biennial. Some of you may have participated in that. Most of the affiliates have conferences and convenings of various types and have had Rabbi Zamor or others come and speak to them, do training and education, training for employees to learn best practices, training also for employers to learn best practices and what they can do and perhaps in some cases shouldn't do in the hiring process. So those learning opportunities have been very key and will be going on whenever there's a movement gathering in an appropriate setting. Coming up, Rabbi Zamor and I are working on an issue of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Journal that will include perspectives from many of the reform affiliates looking at this issue, and we will be developing, the CCAR is developing a responsive, so we'll also develop Jewish text resources around these issues for study by congregations and others. Negotiation skills training, very important. Some of you may know that we did do a training at the recent biennial. CCAR has also had trainings, Women's Rabbinic Network has had trainings, and we've been able, through the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, to promote many of those opportunities. So we are approaching this from both the perspective of the employer, what employers, which are our congregations, our reform institutions, can do to be better employers and to address some of the interventions that Mr. Favreau mentioned, and also from the perspective of employees, particularly the women employees, to help them learn to negotiate better, to understand what they should be asking for, and to get past some of the barriers that we know exist. So where we are now in this effort, you can go to the next slide, in the Reform Pay Equity Initiative is developing what we're calling a toolkit, a congregational toolkit. You can see at the top of the slide where the link is. This is a beta site. It is not the final site, but this will give you an idea of the kinds of resources that are available. It's at the WRJ site right now, so it's wrj.org/reform-pay-equity-initiative. So just remember, Reform Pay Equity Initiative. And here you can get a sense of some of the resources that are here and available for you. There's background information about the issue itself, some of the statistics, although that combined data narrative that I mentioned before is not yet complete. We hope it will be complete in the next few weeks, and that will be posted here when it is ready. We have Jewish text sources that can be used for study as you are laying the groundwork for your community to learn about the issue and to accept that it is a Jewish values issue and to look at it from the perspective of Jewish texts and values. We have combined all the various reform movement policy and resolutions that are relevant. And we have resources that will be helpful to, again, both employers and employees. You can go to the next slide. So what you heard from Mr. Favreau, some of the key interventions that are really important are transparency, recognizing that we need to talk about these issues. We need to talk about them honestly. Those who are hiring, if they want to pay fairly, they need to know what fair pay is, which means they need to know what the going rate is for different positions in different communities. And there are resources and tools available for that, particularly the professional associations of the reform movement. So if a congregation is engaging a cantor, they should be in communication with the Cantors Association, and that association can help provide that kind of data. So transparency is very important. Here you see a little bit screenshot of one of the pages of our Pay Equity Initiative toolkit that shows some of these tools for those who are engaged in hiring. What's cut off is the part about transparency, but here you can see links to implicit bias tests. These are documented, and in fact, even women have bias. I've taken the test, Rabbi Zamor has taken the test. We all have bias. We just need to recognize that we have that bias. And that bias does come into play when we are hiring someone. And if we're aware of it, we can help address it. And then we also have do's and don'ts. The kinds of things that Mr. Favreau just mentioned, like not relying on someone's past salary history, which simply continues that discrimination that may have started with someone's first job and follows them throughout their career. So all of those resources are there. I encourage you to go to that toolkit, scroll around, see what's there for you. And most importantly, this is what you can do to be helpful. We are seeking pilots. We're seeking congregations that are willing to use these resources, to test them for us. Let us know if they are complete. Let us know if they are helpful. Let us know if there are things that are missing that they need in order to be the employers that we know they want to be. So if you think that your community, your organization, or your congregation may want to be a pilot for us of these resources and tools, please let us know. And in fact, I'm going to turn it over in a moment to Allie, who will tell you how to put information in the chat box or in the Q&A field in order to let us know if you're interested and also to ask questions. So let me add an apology for not having introduced Allie earlier. Allison Mallinger is the WRJ Communications and Advocacy Associate. She staffs this Reform Pay Equity Initiative and has been doing a phenomenal job working with us and organizing all these different opportunities. So a thank you and a big shout out to Allison for all the work that she has done. I'm going to turn it over to her now to give you a little bit of information about how you can put in questions. I see there already are a couple of questions, which we'll take in order, and to use the chat box. After Allison gives you that information, we'll give you a few minutes to put in your questions, and I'll let Rabbi Zamor add anything I may have missed on about the toolkit or the initiative, and then we'll go to your questions. Allison?
Thank you so much, Marla, and thank you, Jean-Marc and Rabbi Zamor, for your informative presentations. So now we're going to open up for question and answer. So if you look on the top of your toolbar, you'll see a Q&A box. You're more than welcome to put any questions in there that you have for any of our speakers today. If you have questions specifically about the Reform Pay Equity Initiative or the WRJ Women Act in general. So feel free to put any questions that you have in there, and then we'll have our speakers answer them in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
So I just want to remark on my deep gratitude, the partnership that not only WRN and WRJ has been able to forge over this and many other issues as well, but really all the leadership and stakeholders of the reform movement, to know that we're all working in concert on these issues together, both reflecting within each individual organization, but then using the synergy of all of our organizations together under the reform umbrella to be able to address the wage gap is quite powerful. But the most important members that need to really engage with our conversation now are the people who are the hiring stakeholders. And ultimately, we really all are those stakeholders. The professionals are, and the lay leaders are. So I just want to accentuate that point, but we have a number of questions, so maybe we'll go to those now.
Thank you. All right, the first question I'm going to ask Rabbi Zamor to take first. The question is, who sets the pay scale at larger congregations for rabbis and cantors? The board of trustees is a question, or others?
So when a hire is first being done, usually there's a selection committee. But the actual wage that is associated with the opening, that when they open the position, will be driven by the budget. So it's really the board of directors that sets that kind of those kind of line items within a budget. There is, of course, flexibility. But the more that a community can set the range, whether it's a rabbi, a cantor, educator, executive director, early childhood educator, youth worker, whatever's within that budget and their purview, and they can set a more discrete range of salary that they want to offer and be transparent about that, publicize it that way, and make that clear before they look at any resume. It is healthier for everyone involved.
Thank you. The next question is directed specifically to Mr. Favreau. Given that we acknowledge the issues women have negotiating, what would you advise about having someone else who is better at it doing the negotiating for them?
Okay. And let me just add one thing to what Mary was saying about the last question. She's absolutely right about who sets the salary. It's often good to look carefully at the bylaws of a congregation because they're going to have very specific, well, some of them will have very specific rules about, who's in charge of hiring and what committees are involved and so on and so forth. So it's just a tool, to look at. And as I think she said, everything is negotiable. So they may publicize a certain salary range, but that doesn't mean that you can't, talk to them about, raising that amount or maybe reallocating some money from a certain benefit that you may or may not need into salary. So in terms of having somebody else negotiate for you, I do think gender comes into it in all the ways that we were talking about before, but it really is a comfort level thing and a personality thing. You're in a very, especially if you're a clergy member, you're in a very unique profession where you have a relationship with your employer unlike any other. You are doing, you may be doing the president's, kids' B'nai Mitzvah. You may be doing a funeral for their, parents or, whatever. You have a very close relationship. And a lot of people don't like to do the negotiating because they don't want to put the business aspect with the more pastoral and clergy aspect. That said, some people are very good negotiators. I would let my 9-year-old daughter negotiate anything she wanted to. She'd be better than I would. But it can be helpful if you have some discomfort or feel that you want an advocate who can articulate some of the arguments that can be made for better benefits and a higher salary, to have somebody negotiate for you. And what I would recommend is reaching out to my office or another. There are other attorneys who do this sort of work, and just having a conversation and talking to them about what your thoughts on this are. They'll give you a good sense as to whether they think, you should be doing the negotiating or they should do it for you. But there can definitely be advantages to having somebody jump in and do it for you.
Thank you. The next question I will also turn to Rabbi Zamor. The question is, many women work part-time. Will there be work done on behalf of part-time workers? I presume that means through the Reform Pay Equity Initiative.
Mm-hmm. So the limitations of the Reform Pay Equity Initiative right now is that we're only looking at Reform Jewish professionals who work within the congregational setting, and we're looking at full-time workers in terms of our data. It is where we can collect the best quality data and do the best good with that data. However, we do recognize that this leaves many of our female employees without data to help them. The overwhelming majority of resources that are available through the Reform Pay Equity Initiative will help any employee. So I do want to note that, whether it's learning about what questions should be asked during a negotiation or during an interview, how to do negotiation skills, much of that would help anyone. Right now, we can best recommend that you find colleagues who are in similar positions that are your own, and to use your professional networks to do that, in fact, and to create a small data set of your own of 4 to 6 people, to take the names off and to use that data to help guide you in your congregation or your institution, organization, to try to see if there's a wage gap. Obviously, including men in that is very important. We want to also recognize the great challenge for our educators, and especially our early childhood educators in those professions are so heavily feminized, that is also a challenge. We're very aware of these challenges and the need for attention to these gaps. And I would say we're not quite there yet. We still have this foundational work to do, but we're very aware of what the next steps will be.
Thank you. The next question, I'm going to direct first to Mr. Favreau and then Rabbi Zamor if you want to jump in. The question is about geography. How does geography play into the biases inherent in the gender conversations? The questioner, whose name is Sharon Cohn, suggests that she has had congregations use location as well as congregation size to mitigate the numbers in salary surveys.
It is an issue. I don't think the numbers are as good. I don't think the data is as clear. But oftentimes we look at whether the congregation or organization is in a high cost of living area, and obviously, you know, someone working at a congregation in Washington D.C. and New York is going to be, you know, you can justify a higher salary than a congregation in Omaha or a smaller city or even a more suburban or rural community. So it does, in that sense, it factors into the conversation. Oftentimes, pay increases are tied to the what's called the CPI index, the Consumer Price Index, which is a statistic that's put out by the Department of Labor, and it basically is the inflation, the rate of inflation, and they do that they splice it up into categories based on geography. So you'll see that the pace of inflation, again, is going to be higher in San Francisco than it is in a smaller community. So I'm not sure how to really tie it into the gender conversation, because I think this applies sort of across the board when you're talking about salary numbers.
And I'll add to what Mr. Favreau said, which is right on the money, that the CCAR salary study and the other professional organizations of our 5 professional organizations, which do surveys, that each one of those sets of data are usually communicated with in percentiles, meaning the bottom 25th percentile earns this much within a certain category, the 50th in this category, this many people, and the 75th, this many people. And so obviously, if you are living in San Francisco, you need to be at the very top in the 75th quadrile. If you are living in a much more rural, less expensive area, that then being in the 50th or towards the bottom quadrant might be appropriate given the different cost of living. But of course, we want to see that being applied to everybody equally.
Thank you. I do want to add one other thing that we really haven't mentioned before, and that is, although Mr. Favreau did reference it, the importance of not just being aware of these issues at the time of hiring, but also at the time of evaluations, where there is also a gap in how women are evaluated as compared to men, and opportunities to adjust salaries. So it's important to do that assessment even with your existing staff, and not just at the time you're hiring them, because those gaps exist and they actually grow over time. So to stop and take a look and to do an assessment about what is appropriate and to make those adjustments throughout the time that someone is hired, is engaged with your congregation or organization, and not just at the moment that they're hired. So I think that's an important opportunity for all of us, no matter whether we are hiring actively now. If we have staff, we should be doing this for anyone on staff currently. Jean-Marc, I saw you nodding your head. Do you want to add anything to that?
You said it perfectly. I'm just vehemently agreeing. That's all.
Great, thanks. So we have one last question that I will ask while I'm asking this and we're addressing it. If anyone else has questions, please feel free to type those into the Q&A box or the chat box. The question comes from Cantor Deborah Stern. I'm not sure that we can answer this, but I will ask it anyway. She writes, I am curious to know if the first woman rabbi of the Reform movement, Rabbi Sally Priesand, was given the same salary as the male Reform rabbis. Did this gender gap start with Rabbi Priesand?
Well, I'll be glad to jump in. We never talk about anyone's specific salary or salary history. So I'm not going to address Rabbi Priesand's particular salary history. What I would say is that for every generation of women who forged the path for the rest of us, whether it be rabbis, cantors, educators, executive directors, that all these women, we know from talking to them as individuals and hearing their stories, served under great disadvantage. At the WRN, we particularly like to honor the women who forged that path by calling them our Vatikot. Those who came before us. The women who were ordained between 1972 and 1983 are referred to in this loving way. Those were the classes at HUC-JIR that were not yet equal between men and women. And when they went out into the world, they were often, in every stage of their career, the first. And in talking to these women as individuals, we hear many stories of iniquity and inequality. It is true that their salaries also suffered. And I think it's important to recognize that entire generations of women within the Reform movement, and of course, well beyond, are now hitting retirement with that disadvantage. That they did not earn as much money throughout their careers, that they don't have the same retirement packages, and unfortunately we're still perpetuating this. The thing about money, of course, is the possibilities for it to compound. Just as the wage gap compounds from the first time you are underpaid going forward if it's not addressed. On the positive side, when we correct these things, we're really ensuring for the present and future of the employee.
Thank you. I see no more questions. So let me turn it now to Allison to share any upcoming information, and then I'll close us out with our final thank yous. Allison.
Thank you, Marla. So thank you everyone for participating today. I hope you enjoyed this session, and thank you so much to all of our speakers. This is a continued effort. It's not going to end anytime soon, but we're hopefully getting to closer and closer to that end point. So I hope that you all join us for our next webinar. In May, we'll be focusing on gun violence prevention. WRJ was a big participant in the March for Our Lives. We had women at every major march throughout the country. So we'll be looking at an overview of that with a featured speaker, Zoe Turner, who is the NIFTY Social Action Vice President-elect, and seeing how we can continue to help our youth. If you have any questions about the Reform Pay Equity Initiative or about the webinar series in general, feel free to email me following the session. You all also will receive an evaluation form and a recording of the session following when you get your follow-up email. And I will turn it back to Marla.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I just saw the chat box a message from Lynn Magid-Lazar, a former WRJ president, who notes that today is a call-in day for gun violence prevention. There are also some organizations sponsoring a Twitter storm for Equal Pay Day, so lots of activism opportunities for you. Let me add my thank you to our presenters, Rabbi Zamor, Mr. Favreau, Allison, thank you so much for all you have done. Since it is Equal Pay Day, let's remember to acknowledge the women in our lives who are working women who have had to work all of these extra days into 2018 just to be at par with others who ended where they ended the year in 2017. So give a special shout out to those working women who work extra hard, particularly those who work on behalf of the reform movement, which is of course the focus of our Reform Pay Equity Initiative. So together we are confident that we can make a difference here, that we can close the gap and move the needle on this issue. So thank you all. Have a good day and keep on keeping on. Bye everyone.